So I'm Arik. You may also know me as Ival, and basically I maintain Proton and I work on it for Codeweavers. And here's the history of gaming on Linux. So the ancient times, Windows 3.0, it started getting a little bit popular, and big Unix players started being a little bit afraid what will happen because like all those new applications for productivity and games were being released for it. So some microsystems tried to do something called WABI, Windows Application Binary Interface for Windows, which was like a Wine predecessor, which was proprietary, and they also tried to standardize parts of Windows APIs. So that was public Windows interface, and they were working with IBM, HP, and Novell. And even, at some point, it was even proposed by ECMA as ISO standard. But that has never really materialized. So then the summer of 1993 has came, and Wine has emerged from discussions on Comp OS, Linux, and in 1994, Alexander Juilliard became the maintainer of the project and is our BDFL to this moment. So originally the project was licensed as MIT, but later got relicensed to LGPL 2.1. And the idea was to just run Windows application as best as we can on Linux. Without any extra specs. So we haven't tried to standardize Windows API. We haven't tried to force it on Microsoft through ISO. The idea was to just run stuff and treat Windows as the ground truth. So if you tried to game on Wine back in those days, you know that it was kind of hit and miss. So there was a huge variability when it comes what games were running from a game to from release to release. Games were regressing quite often. There was UpDB, which is still up to this day, which was messy but very helpful way of figuring out what's the golden working configuration. So you could see, oh yeah, there's a Platinum report for a given game from Wine 0.7, and this is probably you should have to use. AAA games rarely did work, and usually when they work, that was years down the line, so you had to play something back from the past. And a bunch of downstreams and ad hoc community patches have appeared. So if you think about launches like Lutris, basically you have a huge list of Wine versions that are supported because this version works with this game, but that version works with a different game, and basically you had to have projects to maintain all that mess. There was no proper QA done by anything in professional setting to focus on games, to run the games, because it's very different when you run unit tests that we have in Wine and when you actually run real software, which is not really easy to automate. So I have experienced that firsthand when I was in high school. I was playing Guild Wars Online in early 2010s. And that has changed a little bit in 2000s because there was something called WineX, later renamed to Sedega, which is a proprietary fork of Wine, which tried to focus on gaming. So they were doing a lot of changes to DirectX implementation we had in Wine, but none of that really has been contributed back because it was a proprietary fork. So this has contributed to relicensing of Wine from MIT or X11 license to LGPL 2.1. So we have something copyleft and we can enforce the license on any downstreams, and there's a fear that more downstreams like WineX will pop up. So within a few years, it fell behind upstream by a huge margin, and the product is no more. If you look for the company that was making it, I think it was called Transgaming. It was publicly traded on Toronto Exchange, and the husk of the company was made into some real estate holding thing. It's a really weird story, so maybe you want to look that up if you want to be entertained. But all of that has changed with Proton. So this is a Valve project that was first released in 2018. That was 3.7, and the number corresponds to the baseline Wine we use. And it's like a distribution of Wine in the same sense as Linux distribution. So Wine is like the core that runs the Windows stuff and translates it. But there's also another projects that accompany it, like DXVK, and we also ship GStreamer. We ship a bunch of different things that contribute to the whole experience. So the work started a few years back, before August 2018. I think it was like 2016 or 17 when it began. The difference from Upstream Wine was that it has included the XVK for running DirectX 10 and 11 at first. We also had the bridges for Steam API. So if you think about games, especially the games on Steam, they run them on the Windows environment, and they expect Windows Steam to be present, and they do Windows API calls to that Steam. And we had provided open source bridges that actually translate the native Windows 32 calls into something that's understandable by the Linux native Steam client. So basically, you could just run the games without having to run Windows Steam inside of Wine, which was a huge improvement over what was done in the past, because people try to run Steam in Wine. The same goes for OpenVR. We just bridged to the native version. And the focus was on the game compatibility, which was a huge thing. So it was also the first time when there was someone backing it, like with money and providing a proper QA where we were testing games. And the biggest thing is that it's regularly based on top of Wine. So we are not a fork. We are like a friendly downstream. So basically, we contribute whatever we can upstream, and the developers working on Proton are primarily, especially the Wine part, are primarily considered to be Wine developers, and they expected to upstream everything they can. So when we launched Proton, there was 27 supported games that we have whitelisted for use. And it was working pretty well for those games. Those were tested. Those were like promised some degree of support. And I highlighted Near Automata because that was like before my times working on Proton. And I think this is the first game I've played using Proton Linux. So it was a really good experience. Then we kept on developing things. So more of games started coming out that use DirectX 12 as the API. So we started shipping VK2D, and later we switched to a VK2D Proton, which is a fork. Also, D9VK, that was a separate project that tried to do the same things that the DXVK does, but for Direct 3D9, got merged into the XVK, and we also started shipping that. We had to implement Media Foundation, which is API for media playback, and it's like very complex, very large API set. And we implemented it on top of GStreamers. You can use like the Linux encoders and decoders through Media Foundation, and it just works. Also, one of the bigger developments is that NVIDIA has jumped with help, and there was a community project started by Jens, DXVK and the API, and he was developing that by himself. And at some point, NVIDIA was interested and started contributing to it as well. And basically, they contributed DLSS support, loading some DLLs that they provide with their Linux driver. So they ship DLLs for consumption of Proton with the Linux driver that the XVK and the API understands, knows how to talk to them, and basically you get all the newest and shiny feature from NVIDIA on Proton. Before that, we had to fake some old AMD card. I think I have a little bit more on that later. So things have changed. We started with 27 supported games 5 years ago, and now we have over 4,000 games that are DECT verified. So that means that they run on Steam Deck and the experience is good. That means text is eligible, it displays correct glyphs, and overall, like, you can play it and there's really nothing to complain. Then on top of that, we have 8,000 other games that are marked as deck playable. So that means that they run, you can play through the whole game. The experience is decent, but like maybe some text is a little bit too small on the built-in screen, so you might have a little bit better experience plugged into TV. And those are just like the official Valve classifications of games. If you look at ProtonDB and look at the top 1,000 of the games that are played by people mostly on desktops, because this is where Steam started. Steam Deck is like last year's invention. 77 of the top 100 games are rated either gold or platinum. That means they're also playable. Like, they just work. We started with a single Proton based on Wine 3.7, and now we ship 4 flavors. So the Proton stable is probably the one that most of people use. Its current version is 8.0-4. It gets extensive QA testing, public RC phase. So we post an issue on the GitHub tracker, and a lot of like media outlets pick up on that, and we get advertisements saying, hey, if you want to test the new stable release, please hop in. We get user reports, we make sure that it works. Usually there are a couple of RCs, and then we release new stable. Then there's Proton Experimental, which we use to crowdsource a little bit of testing on features that are not really ready for prime time. Something like Media Foundation, for example, first shipped through Proton Experimental. And it gets a little bit of QA. So whenever we are merging something that we know is risky, like for example, for windowing integration, then we test that. But also there's a bunch of games, if you check changelogs, that are playable only with Proton Experimental. So we always test those for regressions to make sure that they are still playable. And on Steam Deck, like it's smart enough to know what games are pinned to, and you don't have to really care about different flavors. You just run the game and it will work, whether that's experimental, stable, or whatever. Another flavor is Proton Hotfix. So Proton started getting some traction, and people want to play their games, and there's a lot of AAAs coming. And then usually games release on Friday. And that means we have very short time to create fixes and deploy them for the end users. And you don't want to start a proper Proton release on Friday afternoon. So what we do instead, we merge the fixes in. We release something called Proton Hotfix. We pin that game, the new hotness that's on the market, to that version of Proton, and it just runs. So this is not for desktop users. It's mostly it's mostly for Steam Deck. But as a desktop user, you can select that version manually. And the idea is that this is a very short-lived branch. So usually we give that fix a little bit of time and a little bit of polish, and then it gets merged into experimental proper releases, and we retire that branch completely. Currently, we have 2 games pinned to it. I think it's the Metal Gear Solid collection, especially the third one, the new remasters, and the Lords of the Fallen 2. So, and next week I'm going to make a Proton experimental release that will retire that branch. There's also Proton Bleeding Edge, which is for automated integration of all the components that build Proton. That means the XVK and VAPI, VKD2D Proton, and all the wine changes that were staged for like inclusion in the next build, but haven't been released in any form yet. So this is the most risky stuff, and it's mostly meant for users who know what they're doing and want to contribute to testing ahead of time, but it shouldn't be used by like general public. Also, VKD2D Proton and the XVK developers are using this as their baseline. So basically, this is what they develop against. So you have no idea about Proton. So, but like how all of that started, you probably remember those guys. Those are called Steam machines. And that was interesting attempt. So this predates me by a long margin. I have no insights into what was the idea and what they're trying to push. But my conjecture is that this was to create a market for game developers to port their games onto Linux, because those machines were supposed to be easily dual bootable. They were running SteamOS based on Debian, and they were supposed to entice game developers to actually port their games to that platform. The problem was that most of the game developers wanted to use DirectX or some other like that was basically the only API back in the days, and not OpenGL. And porting your core of the engine to a different graphics APIs is a huge investment, and the market for that was pretty small. So eventually they were phased out. I think they haven't managed to create any kind of market. But then when Proton came out and you were just running Windows games without any modifications, and they were just working fine, that was the first step. The second step is that, we are all not always perfect with Windows support. So there are some quirks. We also often find bugs in Windows games that are also bugs on Windows, but due to scheduling subtleties or like some small differences, don't happen on Windows as often. So, some crash that happens 1 in 50 times. That's okay. That makes it through the QA. But because of Linux scheduler, suddenly it crashes like 8 out of 9 times. So, which is much worse experience. So the good thing would be to get the game developers, to get their games tested on Proton and make that run. And I think that Steam Deck has achieved that really well because it created a lot of buzz around Proton, a lot of buzz around gaming, created a new form factor for PC gaming, basically, because the previous experience on handhelds was not as good as when you run SteamOS. And I think that shows because a lot of game developers are actually releasing games saying that, yeah, it runs on Steam Deck. So that means that the game studio has Steam Decks in-house and they test against it. And we sometimes see like games creating Proton-specific workarounds, but I think more often than not, they just test against that target, make sure that the game settings, like the detail level, can scale low enough to run on the deck and look good and run well. And whenever there's something not quite working, they just figure it out and ship it both for Windows and for Proton without specific workarounds, which is great. So the other thing compared to the bad times of WineX and Sedega is that Proton is completely open source. Like DXVK, VKD2D Proton, all the changes to Wine are just available for everyone. And that has created a very vibrant ecosystem around us. So we are primarily concerned with Steam and running via Steam, and Proton is shipped and packaged in a way that it contains a lot of Steamisms, in a way that we expect environment variables that Steam provides. But there are other downstreams that have built on top of our work. So this is just a reminder for everyone. If you see an issue with, please don't report it to Wine Upstream unless you are sure it also reproducible with Wine Upstream. And the same goes for our downstream. So if you use like a Glorious Egg Rolls Proton, please report it to him instead of us, unless you have tested that on Proton proper. And you are sure that the issue is there. Because if you don't want to test that, please report it to the correct downstream anyway. It will finally make its way to us. So one of the downstreams is something that predates Wine by a long time. That's Wine Staging. It's a collection of patches that are kind of in flight, so they haven't made it into upstream yet, but the idea is that everything there will be upstreamed. It's maintained by Wine developers, including people working on Proton, so there's a lot of overlap there. And currently we have 78 patches of that used by Proton included directly. I think it's actually more than this because some of the Proton patches feed into staging. And I don't think we have accounted for those yet. We haven't tagged them yet. So hello? Okay, now it works. So I will do a recount next rebase. One of the examples is WineTKG, which ships their own Proton build and also standalone wine, so you don't have to use it as a Proton through Steam. That just works. So, and contains the patches that we ship with Proton and plus some community contributions on top of it. Then there's Proton GE Custom and Wine GE, which is used, for example, by Lutris, the wine part. So this also ships with some extra app bits and pieces that we don't ship in the Proton proper, and has a slightly different audience as well. And many more than that. There's also a few launchers. So as I mentioned, back in the days, you had to manage a lot of versions of Wine. So one of the launchers that uses Protonified versions of Wine nowadays is Lutris, and they actually are hoping for getting rid of some of those older versions and limiting it to only the latest and the greatest, because the latest and the greatest just works. So that's the thing. Like most of the games, we don't regress as often as Wine used to in the days, because we have the QA, we have the resources. There's a lot of people testing the games. There's a lot of community eyes on Proton releases. So it's much more stable, especially if you use Proton stable. Then there's also Heroic Launcher. that you probably know from the presentation earlier today. It also uses Protonified versions of Wine with all the patches to make the games run well. And there's crossover, which comes with its own Wine downstream. This is how I would call it. So basically, it's the best way of running games on macOS, especially if those are like AAA games that haven't had ports. Historically, it was used mostly for productivity apps, and historically, it was the only way of funding work on Wine. Now that has changed with some other things like ports and Proton. But basically, if you want to see Wine running on macOS well, like this is the way to go, because this way you show your support. And it runs Cyberpunk, it runs Diablo 4, and it runs Quicken if you are into that sort of thing. Over the years, the technologies that we have been developing for Wine, for Proton, have made their way into some unexpected places. So the previous talk was from Intel, and Intel actually ships DXVK in their Windows drivers. So the Arc GPUs don't have native support for D3D9. Instead, they use something called D3D9 on 12, which is like Microsoft's provided compatibility layer. That was like hit and miss. Some games were running very poorly. And I think they released the driver in December of 2022 that included DXVK. So if you run strings on the binary, you actually find DXVK strings there. They just bundle it in and use it for games where it provides performance uplift. So it's not enabled globally, just on a game-by-game basis, as far as I understand. But yeah, they ship the XVK. The same goes with Apple Game Porting Toolkit. So they shipped it to evaluate your games for making a proper native port onto their hardware. And under the hood, it uses sources of Crossover, which is another Wine downstream, and the license for D2D Metal, which is the compatibility layer to run DirectX 3 on top of Metal, shouts out DXVK as an inspiration. If you look into the readable license file, I don't remember which one was that. And also VirtualBox. So if you install Windows inside of VirtualBox and you install the guest editions and you want DirectX support, it replaces the DLLs for D3D with Wine D3D based build. And also, VirtualBox has now a support for acceleration on the host side. So all the UI and rendering is getting accelerated. And that uses DXVK native, which allows you to write DirectX and compile it natively on Linux. So instead of like having to implement another API backend for the acceleration, on non-Windows hosts, they just use DXVK native. And that's it. I'm with Codeweavers, and if you want to program like some system level C and work on Wine, we are hiring. Any questions?
Thank you. We should have time for a couple of questions. Except everyone was just too tired, which is a possibility always.
Yeah, being the last talk of the day, right? Before there's lightning talks.
Lightning talks
So,
after.
yeah.
So.
Yeah, no questions. I guess that's it.
Going once, going twice. That's it. So
Thank you.
Thank you.